afternoon, and welcome to City Club of Portland Friday Forum. I am John Horvick, President-elect of City Club, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who join us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today, we will discuss the future of higher education in Oregon. But first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and our Friday Forum winter corporate sponsors, Bank of the Cascades, CenturyLink, Miller Nash, Regents Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oregon, and The Standard. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Join us next week when U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley will discuss how we save the American dream. City Club is also pleased to welcome State Treasurer Ted Wheeler and Mayor Charlie Hales during the month of April, so please be sure to purchase your lunch tickets. What do you know about the candidates running for school board? City Club, Northeast Coalition of Neighborhoods, and Concordia University are hosting a Portland School Board Candidates Forum on April 3rd at Concordia University. Our very own Sam Adams will be emceeing the event. You can learn more about club events and purchase tickets on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, City Club will be live tweeting this event. You can follow us or mention us at PDX City Club, and be sure to use the hashtag CityClub in your own tweets. We will be having a Q&A session with the panel at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your questions. And all of our audience participants, please locate the index cards in the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. We'll collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. And now to our program. By 2025, Oregon strives for 40% of Oregonians to hold a bachelor's degree or advanced degree. Another 40% have an associate's degree or other certificate, and all Oregonians to hold a high school diploma or equivalent. Today, our panelists will discuss and debate the proposed reforms to Oregon's higher education model that are being weighed in the legislative session. As Chancellor of the Oregon University System, Melody Rose is responsible for ensuring support for and carrying out many of the initiatives of the Oregon State Board of Higher Education. Prior to joining OUS, Melody served as Vice Provost for academic programs and instruction at Portland State University, where she was responsible for all matters related to undergraduate and graduate student curricula and instruction. Of course, she also served as president of City Club from 2011-2012. Melody, it's a special privilege to have you back on stage with us today. A former teacher and state representative, Ben Cannon, is the education policy advisor to Governor John Kitzhaber. After his time as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, Ben taught at the Arbor School of Arts and Sciences. During his time in the legislature, he chaired the Environment and Water Committee and served on committees related to healthcare and education. It should also be noted that Ben, too, has been an active member of City Club, and prior to his service with the state, he helped produce the club's influential early childhood education research report. As executive director of the Oregon Student Association, McLain is passionate about increasing the civic engagement of young people in Oregon's political process. Under Emily's leadership, the Oregon Student Association has registered over 80,000 students to vote. Also successfully capped tuition increases and passed the legislation to combat bullying of students of color, LGBT students, and other underrepresented communities in Oregon schools. Heather Conroy was elected executive director of SEIU Local 503, a local representing 45,000 state, university, and local government and nonprofit workers, as well as publicly funded care providers and nursing home workers in Oregon. Heather is widely regarded as a leader in the national labor movement, serving as the vice president of SEIU, the fastest growing union in North America. And so without further ado, please help me welcome today's panelists.
Thank you, John. It feels great to be back at City Club. Standing at this podium feels just a little bit like coming home. Today I've been asked to speak to the way forward in higher education in Oregon, and I have to say I really like that charge because it's a call to action. It's an imperative to face the changing realities of higher education and to meet the state's 40-40-20 goal, which requires far more college-educated Oregonians than we are currently producing. It's time to start viewing education as the crisis that it is. For the first time in global history, our nation is producing a generation of adults less educated than their parents. So the stakes for people, communities, and the Oregon economy could not be higher. The options for success are narrower, and the second chances are fewer. Status quo is simply not an option. It's time, folks. The pace of change in technology, the pressures on state budgets, and the movement from local to global are impacting our institutions and systems of higher education at a pace so fast that adaptation is constant. It's clear that the world has changed and is challenging the traditional higher ed business model. Whatever topic in higher education you can think of, lurking behind it, under it, and around it is the need to address the full-scale national disinvestment in higher education that challenges our economic vitality, our educated citizenry, and frankly, as a political scientist, I have to say, democracy itself. Most of you have heard the dark side of higher education funding, but it bears repeating today. The Oregon University system is ranked 44th in per student funding nationally. Our state appropriation is less than it was in 1999, and that is not inflation adjusted. And in that time, we've grown by over 23,000 students, basically adding the equivalent of another University of Oregon to the state system on fewer dollars. Our state financial aid for students ranks 43rd in the country, and 77% of our students are receiving some type of need-based aid. And we all recognize that the increases in public university tuition are pricing many Oregonians out of their American dream. Students today are covering over 70% of the cost of their education. 10 years ago, they covered only 50. And because of those prices, the student loan debt is staggering. But in the midst of this, all of this, our public university system, with now over 100,000 students, managed to provide a quality higher education to our students, achieving record levels of annual degrees, now over 20,000 per year. We had the highest percentage increase enrollment in the last 5 years in the nation. We have a faculty who rank 7th in the nation in per faculty federal grants. And the system is considered a national leader in many areas of teaching and learning innovation, transfer programs with our valued community college partners, and pre-college work. So what's the problem? The problem is that today's student in Oregon is poorer, is borrowing more, is working harder, and is underserved, meaning they come from a rural area or are a student of color from a low-income background, and they're also far more likely to be a parent, a veteran, or frankly, all of the above. The stakes are higher now for these students and for our entire education enterprise. We have a moral crisis on our hands. We can call it doing more with less, but that puts us in a deficit mindset that often freezes forward momentum. Or alternatively, we can flip that on its head, and we can call it doing things differently to get better outcomes for all students. That's the way forward. So we need to recalibrate on a whole number of fronts, because if we're pessimistic about how we reach 40-40-20, I do not know how we can expect our students all 100,000 of them, to be optimistic about achieving what we need them to achieve to become part of today's workforce. So let's change the script and change our higher education system to reflect the realities of today's students and tomorrow's economy. We've heard it from Moody's and now from a new report funded by the Gates Foundation. The current financial model in higher education is no longer viable. Some predict that 40% of American universities will no longer exist within a generation if we don't change. A new approach is a must, or higher education will move from the endangered species list to the extinction list. That involves change in every segment of university operations, the academic model, and in our partnerships. Today's business model for earning a degree is predicated on the credit hour and the assumption that accumulating seat time in any particular major will eventually earn a student a degree. In the old days, that took 4 years. Now, it takes 5.5. A few things are pushing back on this model, and we have to take them very seriously. One is a model toward credit for prior learning or proficiency-based education, which allows us to move students forward when they demonstrate mastery of a subject rather than when the term is complete. One part of this revolution, as you know from reading the headlines, is online learning. As a method for delivering education to students, online learning can be incredibly effective. It's a modality that this generation of students is very familiar with, but it's not free, and it tends to be most effective when it's combined with in-class faculty-engaged learning, or what we call a hybrid approach. Some students can be very successful at taking their coursework online, but for others, including those who are less academically prepared, online learning alone may not be the best way forward for them to engage in the college experience. We have to get back to a place where more of our students are able to get a bachelor's degree in 4 years. Our students simply cannot afford 5.5 years per degree when they are also likely borrowing for it. I'm convinced that moving students faster is a key accelerator in achieving 40-40-20. And while we're very efficient in degree production now, as I mentioned earlier, we are least efficient with our most underserved students. And if we want them to be successful in the workforce, we have to get them from here to there. Equity is possible in Oregon. I know this because of one fact that gives me tremendous hope. When you control for academic preparation received before college, all students demonstrate the same graduation rate regardless of background or ethnicity. That gives me hope because we know what we need to do to prepare these students. And this is why OUS is committed to supporting pre-K through 12 through teacher preparation, through dual credit, and a wide variety of pre-college programs. We get that we need our education partners to succeed because when they succeed, we succeed. And because I'm an optimist, here's the hopeful part again. I have never seen before in nearly 20 years in higher education in Oregon the excitement, the dedication, and the will to move forward around higher education than we are currently experiencing. Education leaders are viewing innovation as the way to move the conversation forward so we can do better for all students and fulfill our promise to this generation. So let's all work together to change the conversation. But then let's also push each other to move beyond conversation and into action, because we simply do not have time to waste. Every wasted year, we lose thousands of students from the education pipeline, consigning them to a life of lost income, knowledge, and dreams. If we don't prepare our young people well, if we don't change, if we don't get them the degrees they need and connect them to Oregon's changing economy, they suffer and Oregon's prosperity is threatened. 40-40-20 can change all of that. Thank you. And now I'll pass this to my colleague, Ben Cannon.
Thank you. It's a real honor and privilege to share this stage with Dr. Rose and Emily and Heather, as well as to be with the City Club again today. So Dr. Rose, I think, has done a terrific job outlining some of the challenges as well as opportunities facing higher education in Oregon and nationally. The question for the governor and for me as his advisor now that I want to focus on today is what we can do in 2013, and in particular in this legislative session that's underway, to best position Oregon to take advantage of the opportunities and minimize the pitfalls as we work to achieve the state's ambitious goals for education. And what I'm going to describe for you are a set of proposals related to the structure of higher education in Oregon that the governor, working alongside outstanding legislative champions such as Senator Mark Hass and Representative Michael Dembro, who's here today, are in the process of developing and bringing forward to their colleagues that attempt to respond in some really important ways to some of what Dr. Rose has described. So I'm going to talk about structural changes that would generally do the following things. First, they would create greater local autonomy for our universities in the form of institutional boards for campuses, similar to the institutional boards that govern our community colleges. They would create greater levels of state coordination of the entire post-secondary system, not merely the university system, but also our community college system, as well as our financial aid system, in order to guide the state funding and policy setting decisions for colleges, financial aids, and universities. So you can imagine this as greater local autonomy, local boards, as well as a single state board or commission to replace the 4 that deal with separate aspects of the post-secondary system today. So it's easy, I think, when we talk about structural changes for sort of eyes to glaze over and for us to lose sight of the connections, the important sort of underlying reasons for doing it. So I want to really focus on those reasons and that rationale. And I'll start with a point that Dr. Rose made, I think, really persuasively related to resources and resource adequacy. The governor understands that our system of public education is underfunded at all levels, and that achieving the state's ambitious goals for educational attainment will not be possible at our current level of public investment. And for the governor, that fact raises really important questions about our system of public finance and its ability to provide both the adequacy and the stability necessary to do the job. As a result, he's asked business leaders, labor leaders to bring to him and to bring to the legislature a plan, not probably one that would be adopted this session, but one that would go to voters some point down the road, to increase the level of public investment in education at all levels. But it is also clear to the governor and many others that the resources, many of the resources of energy, of time, of commitment, of will, and of dollars that will be necessary to do the job exist not merely, or not principally even, in the public coffers, but come through better harnessing the capacity that exists in local communities, in philanthropists, in businesses, in business leaders, in community-based organizations, nonprofits, and individuals at all levels. And institutional boards, including those that are proposed for the University of Oregon, for Portland State, possibly OSU, are opportunities to more deeply engage local communities in the ownership, if you will, in the governance, and in the work of our universities. We believe there to be a terrific private funding opportunity associated with them that can begin to not sufficiently address the question of resource adequacy, but can help us as part of a strategy to lift some of the burden from students and enhance public higher education in Oregon. But it's not merely a question of resource adequacy, it's also one of how we deploy those resources. And I'll point out that today in Oregon higher education, we have 3 separate boards deciding how to distribute the state allocation to community colleges, to universities, and to need-based financial aid. This means, for example, that there's no evident relationship between what the state pays for a course at a community college and what the state invests in a similar course at a university. We don't have a single place in the state to have that discussion, and it makes it very difficult to have to employ a coherent state strategy related to how we allocate precious state resources. And I would say particularly in a world where we don't know precisely what the delivery model in higher education will be in 2 years or 5 years or certainly 10, the state should have the agility to deploy resources not principally or primarily in terms of institutional preservation, but in terms of student success, with a kind of agnosticism about at which institutions that success is achieved. The third point I'll make related to these proposed structural governance changes is the role that we believe they can help create in enhancing the already strong levels of collaboration and connection between different parts of Oregon's higher education system today. We're proud that we have one of the highest percentages of graduates, baccalaureate graduates in the state, who have begun their careers in higher education at community colleges. That's a testament to the work of the Oregon University system, community colleges, the joint boards, and the articulation work that's gone on between the two. And that success is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we could do to make the post-secondary system more student-friendly in Oregon. The governor last week spent time in Pendleton learning about the Eastern Promise, which brings K-12 teachers, community college instructors, university faculty in a room together designing common course material, common assessments, to design to, in a common way, establish what constitutes proficiency, for example, in a Math 120 course, so that fewer students are forced to repeat courses or on meandering pathways through high school to college that undermine their ability to complete. We need much deeper levels of integration across the entire P20 system. Partly this is about handoffs. It's about the transitions between early learning and K-12, between K-12 and community college, between community college and higher and universities. But handing off is probably the old model in higher education. Increasingly, we see students accessing education and higher education in particular, not as a set of linear experiences at institutions back to back, but as a web, where what constitutes a degree will include courses taken at high school, in college, at a community college, at a university, online, work-related experiences, credit for prior learning, internships, etc. And it seems to us that the state structure should be one that supports that type of integrated web of learning, not put barriers up in front of it. The final point I'll make is that I think we have an incredible opportunity here through the establishing of a single coordinating entity for higher education in Oregon to bring a level of attention to this subject that has been lacking for too long. Clearly, this is a state, like many, that has paid too little attention to its system of higher education over the last couple of decades, and we've seen that so clearly in the dwindling share of state resources that our colleges and universities have received and the increasing burden that's placed on students. And one of the real opportunities we have here through creating a single state commission that would work in conjunction with the Oregon Education Investment Board, a P20 board, and staff would bring a level of attention and priority to higher education that just hasn't been evident in this state. 40-40-20 by the year 2025 is an aspirational goal. It's a goal about the type of economy and the type of citizenry that we want and we need in this state. The work that we're proposing, the structural work that we're proposing this session, is just the beginning, but it can help lay the foundation for the series of steps that we need to take in order to reach it. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Emily. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Student Association, and I really appreciate the applause earlier for voter registration. I want to tell you a little bit about the Oregon Student Association, and then I'll follow up on the remarks from Dr. Rose and Ben as well. I'd first like to just explain that OSA was founded back in 1975, and we represent over 100,000 students in Oregon across the state at both public universities and community colleges. So I think we're the folks on the panel who also are looking both holistically at community colleges and universities as well, because that's where our members come from. We believe that students should be involved in the decisions that impact them, and we work to ensure that every Oregonian has access to an affordable and accessible quality education. And over the last 10 years, we've actually registered over 160,000 students to vote. And just this last year, I just want to add to the 80,000, 50,000 of those students were registered just in 2012, which we're really proud to say. And we like to say that students don't have a lot of money, but we have a lot of us. So we appreciate being invited to have a discussion about the future of higher education and also about the proposed governance reform that's taking place in the Oregon legislature right now. I'm going to talk to you about a few things. The first is OSA's position on the proposed governance changes, and I think Ben focused predominantly on the Department of Post-Secondary Education, but I'll bring one new aspect to the table, which is Senate Bill 270, that has the proposed changes to give PSU and U of O and potentially other campuses an institutional board, which changes the structure of our higher education governance in the state. And I'll talk to you about some of our concerns, and I'll also talk to you about what we've supported and a little bit about the proposed changes that students in the state are taking to the legislature on Senate Bill 270. And finally, I'd like to talk to you about affordability and the conversation that Dr. Rose laid out so well, the real problem statement and what we believe to be the true issue at hand, affordability versus focusing on governance changes. And I'll also make sure that you know how to get involved when I'm done, because we want you to get involved too. So OSA is opposed to the proposed institutional board governance changes in Senate Bill 270, and though we are more optimistic about the Department of Post-Secondary Education that Ben explained. First and foremost, students believe in the ability of a statewide system to maintain accessible and affordable post-secondary education for all Oregonians, which is why we support oversight from an entity like the Oregon University System or the Higher Education Coordinating Commission or the Oregon Education Investment Board. But we have some concerns. The first is that I just named 3 different boards that most of you aren't very familiar with, and that we're making significant changes to those. The first is that we really truly believe that a statewide system is better. Unfortunately, as many of you have probably seen in the media and throughout political discourse, the current proposals and slow but definite changes and moves away from the Oregon University System's role is the legislative movement to decentralize and also to deregulate a way that we run our colleges. Our first contention is that this does not result in increased quality or accessibility to Oregon students or Oregon families. In fact, the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education argues that states that use a single board to govern all 4 institutions are more likely to have higher graduation rates compared with those states that used mixed governance arrangements. A statewide system is important to meeting the goals of our state, just like 40-40-20 that Ben outlined. And we believe with all of our resources and our finest institutions working together, we can achieve more than if each institution works in a silo. Next, we're concerned about competition and the loss of economies of scale. OSA knows that a statewide system is better for Oregon families. We've previously supported bills like Senate Bill 240, which Senator Hass championed, and a lot of other folks as well, because it allowed for flexibility for institutions like Portland State University and the University of Oregon and Oregon State when they were asking for that ability to govern their own schools more. But we also believe that maintaining accountability to folks like elected officials who are directly voted into their positions to represent us is very important to meet those statewide goals. In fact, in 1929, we created a statewide system in Oregon because there was too much infighting and competition happening between schools within the legislature. If this legislative session is any indication of the conflicts that could arise, OSA would again prefer a system that thinks about the benefit of all of its players. Some institutions claim to be able to stabilize tuition costs with a large endowment, but at the same time, that doesn't commit to in-state versus out-of-state ratios to think about how many Oregonians are we actually educating versus how many out-of-state students are we educating in our school. Oregon is actually one of the most price-sensitive states in the country, and we believe that without checks and balances from a statewide board and the legislature, that we could see our big schools as only a place for those who are wealthy or for the few fortunate to receive a scholarship. This places a burden on educating more middle-income Oregonians on our regional campuses with less support. We believe that local boards in K-12 education, and particularly the boards of education that govern our community colleges, are different than the proposed changes because they're elected. They're elected by the people within their districts. And we're not quite sure how folks suggest that the university boards will stay accountable to Oregonians with the proposed institutional board changes. Furthermore, in a world with ever-increasing competition for scarce state resources and pressure for institutional success, how will we ensure college stays affordable and that one institution does not overshadow others, especially our regional campuses? And I have to note that our regional campuses in LeGrand, in Monmouth, in Ashland, all over the place, in Klamath Falls, they serve a very particular and important access point for Oregonians that can't move or that can't afford the cost of other institutions. I'd also like to say that we know that a centralized board that focuses on a statewide picture can limit unnecessary duplication of programs and provide shared services that can limit administrative bloat. As U of O and PSU have been working to fortify their administrations and prove institutional board readiness, their administrative costs have gone up 166% at the University of Oregon and 144% at PSU since 1996, increasing campus lawyers, contracting personnel, student affairs, et cetera. These have increased administrative costs have led to tuition increases and fewer direct services for students. Our next concern is about representation. We want to be very clear that we believe that student representation is a key component to the success of any governance structure. With students paying far more for state public education, just like Dr. Rose talked about, where the state used to pay a majority of the cost and students are now paying over 70% of the cost to run our institutions, we believe that students should be at the table and have a vote. Currently, we have 2 students who sit on the State Board of Higher Education, but the proposed institutional boards only have 1 student, and that's a recent addition. We believe that we shouldn't be going backwards in student representation of those who are being directly impacted by these changes, but also who are footing the bill. Next, we're concerned about tuition. If we were to go with the current proposed changes, and there's a 5% cap on tuition changes right now, which we're actually glad about because we were concerned we were going to lose the 5% cap even. If we were to increase tuition at 5% over the next 15 years, or tuition, would double at the University of Oregon in the next 15 years if we were to increase 5% each year. And inflation-adjusted tuition charges have surged since 1980. Inflation-adjusted tuition and fee charges have increased by 247% at state flagship universities across the country, and by 230% at state universities and colleges, and by 164% at community colleges since 1980. I've outlined some of the concerns that we have with the changes, and I do want to say again that we're very optimistic about the proposed changes for the Department of Post-Secondary Education, but we're not certain if those changes will be able to go through. And like I said, when we look at the idea of having a holistic and clear statewide system of governance versus a multi-tier system of governance where we have institutional boards, we have the Department of Post-Secondary Education, the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, the Oregon University System, the list goes on, we're concerned about how that system flows, and we think we should actually be moving to something more centralized and simplistic and easy to understand, rather than something that's more complicated and doesn't look out for the holistic needs of our entire state. Next, I'd like to explain really quickly that students are coming to the table on this issue and proposing changes. Even though we have concerns about the proposed changes, we believe that we need to ensure that student needs are met, including on keeping tuition affordable and limited, adding student seats as well as faculty and staff seats to the institutional boards that are proposed, and also looking at out-of-state versus in-state ratios of students. If we have a goal of 40-40-20, but we're not bringing more Oregonians in the door, then I don't think we're going to get there. Next, I want to talk about affordability and funding versus governance changes. I left a handout in the back, and I hope that you all will take a look at it, but I want to talk about the real issue at hand for students. Dr. Rose discussed the issue of affordability, and I think that that is the true issue that's facing Oregon students, Oregon families, and Oregon taxpayers. The most significant debate occurring in our state legislature is about how our schools will be governed and not about funding and student debt. The 100,000 members that we represent across the state and their student leaders on all of our campuses are fed up. They're having conversations about the ability to buy textbooks and food. They're having conversations about whether or not they're going to be able to continue their education. And we have people elongating their stay in our universities because of the costs that they're being faced and burdened with. So I just want to share a few facts with you. Student debt in this country is out of control. In fact, 68% of students are graduating with debt in our state. And Oregon, unfortunately, meets the national average and trend of students graduating from an undergraduate degree with over $25,000 in debt. The average student loan payment is about $250 a month, and that for many people ages 18 to 24 is about half our amount of rent each month. And Americans now have more student loan debt than they do credit card debt as they leave school. And unfortunately, at the same time that we're taking out more and more amounts of debt, our state has continued to disinvest in our education. And that's the biggest problem, we believe, is that we need to focus on student debt, on the level that our state is investing in our public universities and community colleges, and not necessarily how we are governed. We're engaging in those conversations, but the real and true situation at the heart of our students and at the heart of Oregon families across the state who are trying to make sure that we can build a better state and have a better economy, it's debt. It's debt and it's affordability. So finally, and it is my time to move on, so I just want to say that I hope that many of you in this room will get involved in this. I hope that you'll consider the amount of debt that you've taken out in college. I hope you'll consider the amount of debt that your students or your grandparents or your grandchildren are taking out, and I hope that you'll get involved. One way to do that is to make sure that you're contacting your state legislature and all of your representatives and senators in Salem, some of them are right here in this room, and making sure that they know the trade-offs that are being made for students, choices between food and gas and rent, and also the need to be able to achieve a college degree that can really make our state better. Because I think when it comes down to it, when students are making choices that they can't afford to purchase a car, they can't afford to purchase a home, or they can't afford to finish their degree, then we're not really working towards that goal of 40-40-20 and a better society of folks who are able to contribute as much as they possibly can. So I really very much appreciate your time. Thank you.
So good afternoon. 4,000 of the 55,000 members of our union work on the 7 Oregon University campuses. They interact directly with students in areas from counseling to financial aid, to labs and libraries, to dining and health. Others provide aspects of facility needs, things like carpentry, cartography, and locksmithing to actually operating a nuclear reactor. And as proud as I am of their work, I'm not just going to focus on the 4,000 members of our union who work at the universities. Instead, I want to talk about the 55,000 members of our union who, like most other working and middle-class families, are far too many of them cannot afford to send their kids to college. And while those who are able to send their kids to college are struggling in the ways that Emily just talked about, they're scraping to get by, figuring out how to take on debt. You heard recently from some Portland State students at a Friday forum, and Emily just outlined it. The issue that we have facing us in higher education really is that students are borrowing and mortgaging themselves into adulthood, and having barely sustainable debt, sacrificing the chance to own their own homes, to properly support their own kids, and in many cases abandoning their dreams of higher education. So in the face of this worsening crisis of inaccessible and unaffordable education opportunities, some campus presidents want Oregon to decentralize the university system, minimizing the role of the Board of Higher Ed and increasing administrative costs. Some proposals under consideration in Salem could eliminate the board entirely and create the Department of Post-Secondary Education that we just heard about. And we can only hope that the acronym that has come with that department isn't aptly fitting. The acronym's DIPSY, which worries me a little bit. So my biggest concern is that these proposals are really less about streamlining and making higher education more affordable and accessible to working and middle-class kids than they really are about shielding decision makers. giving presidents carte blanche to operate pretty much outside of the public view, and really holding themselves accountable only to a few hand-picked patrons who would serve on their own boards. Given that the state of public higher education in Oregon is in such a crisis, some critics have called this approach really rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. But I actually liken it to something worse. I see it more as somebody sitting at the captain's table as the ship goes down, deciding what wine and cigars they're gonna have with their dinner. This approach of radical restructuring and greater independence doesn't address the fundamental obstacle in achieving the 40-40-20 plan, and that's making higher education accessible and affordable to all of Oregon's kids. This approach of restructuring and greater independence is really actually rooted in 3 myths that I want to talk about. First myth, public oversight is unwarranted because legislative appropriations offset barely 1/10 of the university's budgets. That's true. A series of governors and legislators have made really hard choices and have steadily reduced funding for the universities. And this is something that SEIU members here, and I know many of you have fought hard to turn around. But really, if we think about it, who do the university officials think Oregon students their families are if they're not the public? When we factor in the tuition and the fees, as we just heard about, 3/4 of OUS income is from public funds. Aren't those who provide the funding entitled to a voice on how our money is spent? Myth number 2, administrators are doing their own kind of scraping and belt buckling or belt tightening to optimize resources in these trying times. I can't disagree more, unfortunately. 2 years ago, a research team that was commissioned by our union analyzed university spending. Our report exposed unauthorized pay raises for some selected employees at the U of O and at Portland State University. Well, that made headlines. The more profound revelations that we found was just how much administrative bloat exists across the system. As the ratio of staffs to students decreased nearly 28% in the key areas of instruction, research, and student services over 14 years, the ratio of administrators increased by nearly 11%. At the U of O alone, the ratio of administrators to students rose by 48%, while the overall staff ratio, which includes teachers and the support staff who work with students every day, fell by 13%. We also spotlighted in that report the OUS edifice complex, a 6-year building splurge that increased debt service by $77 million and added another $184 million to annual operating costs. Does that sound like belt tightening to you? The third myth is that accountability and transparency overburden administrators. Our most prominent higher educator, Oregon State's President Ed Ray, had debunked that myth plainly and clearly. As chief academic officer at Ohio State, Dr. Ray dealt with an institutional board. And according to Dr. Ray, and I quote, its members frequently obsessed over micromanaging trivia, ignored systemic issues, and spent substantial resources on their own operations. By contrast, Dr. Ray went on to testify that the Higher Education Board in Oregon has not micromanaged operations or required overly burdensome reporting. So really, to Emily's point, how can these institutional boards really help have a holistic approach to higher education that our state desperately needs? So those are the myths, and I now want to focus on some of the realities. First is the restructure pushed by some campus presidents and their patrons is more likely to make things worse rather than better, particularly for working class and middle class students, their families, teaching faculty, and frontline staff. They'll almost certainly increase administrative costs, which is the last thing that we need in this environment. Jay Kenton, the longtime vice chancellor for finance and administration at the OUS, put the added price tag to $3 to $8 million per year per board. Second, decentralization will harm campuses in Ashland, Klamath Falls, LeGrand, and Monmouth. These 4 universities, as we just heard, extend educational opportunities and serve as critical economic engines in hard-pressed rural Oregon. Western Oregon University interim president Mark Weiss told a state committee last year, and this is also a quote, pitting one campus against another in competition to survive creates winners and losers. Oregon and Oregonians cannot afford losing institutions of higher education and supporting the 40-40-20 goal. And competing universities does a disservice to its citizenry. So third, giving more independence or power to campus presidents and their patrons will create an atmosphere ripe for cronyism and potentially corruption. And just consider one example. What are we supposed to conclude when a wealthy alumnus offers to fund an athletic arena, which ends up being publicly financed through bonds instead? Or when that patron withholds support for his alma mater unless the president compels the students to back off their campaign to make sure that campus gear is manufactured in humane conditions and not in sweatshops. There are things more important in higher education than spiffy uniforms and eye-catching logos. One is integrity. Another is academic performance. When the Ducks fell 2 spots to the Crimson Tide in the BCI polls last year, it was big news. We all paid attention, I'm sure. But how many of you noticed that the US News ranked Oregon 38 places behind Alabama academically? So I'm a fan too. I grew up in Pittsburgh where football is like a second religion. But I'm also a Penn State graduate, which is reason enough for me to want to take another look at our priorities. I know that Melody, Ben, and Emily, and many of you all feel we can and should do better, but eliminating transparency and accountability is probably not the best way to start. We need to be focusing our attention on how do we make the dream of a college degree something that every kid in this state can achieve, whether your mom's a home care worker or a corporate executive, whether you live in Burns or Eugene, whether you go to high school at Jefferson or Riverdale. We owe it to our future, and we owe it to our kids. Thank you.
Thank you all for your insight, as well as your work you've done to advance higher education in Oregon. And now, if you have a written question on an index card, please hold it high so City Club staff can collect it from you. The first question for our speakers, as always, will be from today's Friday Forum host, Leslie Morehead. Leslie is on the club's Board of Governors. She served as secretary from 2010 to 2012, and she was named Member of the Year in 2010. Leslie?
Thank you, John, and thank you to the panel. I'm so curious about the name 40-40-20 and all the conceptual thinking that went into that. When we talk about higher education, of course, the assumption is that people have already graduated from high school. So I think you can think of the 40-40-20 plan as 40-40-100. And that's a great goal. I love the name. I love the concept, the ideas, the enthusiasm behind it. But I think there's only 4 countries in the world that have over a 95% graduation rate from high school. And I don't even think there's a dozen countries in the world that have over a 90% graduation rate from high school. So this is the sort of the big, fat, hairy, audacious goal, which we used to talk about in the strategic planning world, and I'm all in favor of those. So I have 2 questions, because I'm concerned about failing. First of all, I have a question for Emily and a question for Melody. Emily, since you graduated from high school not too long ago, I want to know, as the spokesperson for your generation, how doable is it to have a goal of every single young person graduating from high school in our state? And Melody, in terms of the evaluation and assessment of these, how do we have a goal that is, I won't say it won't be met, but it's likely that it won't be met, or there's no place in the world that we can point to that has met that goal? And what do you do about evaluating and assessing the end game, or should we have set ourselves a slightly different goal?
Great, thank you. I graduated from high school a while ago, let's just be honest. I'm a proud graduate of Forest Grove High School. Actually, I didn't mention I'm a 5th generation Oregonian, and I've grown up here, and I was educated then at the University of Oregon, where I graduated with a bachelor's degree. I'm not really prepared to answer the question, how possible is it? I think it's very possible. I think I think one issue is that our K through 12 schools, even though I don't work on those issues that much, are faced with the same financial issues and constraints that the universities and community colleges are faced with. I think that they're dealing with depleting resources, losing teachers, losing folks who make their schools run. And I think that we have to look holistically at our investment in education, and our argument for funding colleges and universities more adequately applies across the spectrum, because we think of education starting from the moment you walk into preschool or early learning to the opportunity that you have to attend a graduate degree or achieve a professional degree. So I think that financial issues are a barrier facing us having 100% graduation from our high schools.
And thank you, Leslie, for not even hinting at when I might have graduated from high school. So I support Emily's response, of course, and I would just say a few things that might be additive. One of the things that the Oregon University system works on every single day is coordinating our efforts in higher education with the K through 12 system, and we do that most recently through what are called the Common Core standards. So I'm looking at my colleague Karen Marangel. Dr. Marangel is working nationally to coordinate the standards for graduation from high school with entrance requirements for post-secondary education. And making that a seamless transition will, of course, ease students through the system and will give them reason to kickstart into the next phase of their education process. So there are specific things that we in higher education do with great passion and interest to assist us in getting to that 100%. And speaking as both the first in my family to go to college and the first woman in my family to cross the graduation line of high school without a baby on my hip, I will tell you that I am deeply committed to helping our partners in K through 12. And whether we hit 90 or 95% or 100%, that would be a tremendous success. So I'm all for holding on to that 100% and scratching and clawing to get us as close as we can possibly get.
We'll now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking a question at the Friday Forum microphone is a privilege of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, identify yourself as a City Club member. Please ask only one question and ask your question as succinctly as possible. I will flash this question mark if need be. With our first question, go ahead.
Carol Witherell, City Club member. First, thank you so much for fine presentations. My question builds on Emily's advocacy for serious representation of the voices and presence of students on all levels of institutional boards and planning discussions. It's the same question I hope everyone will ask our school board election candidates, and that is, how are students' voices and representation included in planning and institutional boards at all levels? And what are you learning from students as you rethink the higher education system? And that probably would go to Ben and Melody, but anyone feel free.
Well, I'm happy to speak to it. I think that it is important, vitally important, that we get student voices on any board that has to do with higher education. That would certainly be true for institutional voices, that student voices are institutional boards get the benefit of student voices just as our Oregon Student Access Commission does today, just as our State Board of Higher Education does today. And students bring a very particular perspective. It's one that is deeply influenced, I think, by what you heard from Emily around the increasing cost and unaffordability and student debt associated with higher education. It's also a voice, I think, that is increasingly concerned about access questions related not just to the cost, but the time to degree, which is related to cost, and the time when classes are available, the fact that more and more students are balancing courses with their lives as in the work world, their lives as parents. We have more older students in higher education than ever before. And so devising a system that responds to those types of very student-oriented challenges, I think, needs to be at the forefront of our minds.
I would just add one thing, and I want to thank you very much for the question, because the question is at the center of debate currently in proposed amendments, or the lack thereof, in our legislature. And if you believe that the student voice should be a part of the voting and discussion of decisions, I would encourage you to tell your legislator that, and tell them that we need 2 students at least on the institutional boards that are proposed. But I would also mention that sitting next to Melody and with all the Oregon University folks in the room, that we've greatly appreciated the involvement of students in conversations about tuition levels and on governance of university committees, and also community college committees as well. And so I have to say that the university system has worked with us a lot, and the fact that we were invited to be here today and are participating in conversations in the legislature is a good sign. But it's not a good sign if the changes don't continue to progress and in fact take steps backwards.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. I'm wondering why education is taking longer and longer. I happened to go to school on a very unusual program at the University of Chicago, where you didn't have to finish high school to go to college if you could pass the entrance exam, and you didn't have to take any course that you could pass an exam in. I understand that there was one person in the history of the University of Chicago who entered the university, passed all the tests, and went right into graduate studies. Has this been considered, and if not, why not?
So I'll take a crack at that, if I may. The single most important reason that it now takes on average 5.5 years to complete a bachelor's degree is cost. There is no better explanation. We have shifted the price of admission from the state nationally over the course of the past generation, from the state to students. And in so doing, we have created a burden for them in working and taking out loans that many of us in this room did not experience. I can say as a first-generation college student in the state of California that invested very heavily in me, I was able to go to school at a regional public university at very little cost, thankfully. Otherwise, I would not be your chancellor today. And so I'm extremely grateful for that experience, and I think I've paid back my debt. I think I've done a fairly good job. And so I think cost is number one. We know that students who work 12 or fewer hours per week outside of their studies stay on track and on time to degree. Students who work in excess of that incrementally experience longer and longer time to degree. So that is the single biggest barrier that we face today nationally, and it's something that we have to take ownership of now.
Here's a question from the floor. Everybody here, I think, mentioned funding as a problem. And so this question asks just where are the adequate revenue streams to increase funding for higher education?
Well, there's no easy answer to that question. I mean, that is a question that has consumed Oregon public debate for at least, the 20 years that I've paid any attention, and I suspect it was going on well before that. So, there are a variety of proposals that have been discussed. The governor has participated as a legislator and legislative leader, and as a previous governor and now governor, in helping in supporting and bringing to the floor and bringing to voters prior efforts to improve and increase revenue for Oregon, and he'll be there again when the time is right, when there's a strategic plan, when it can be won, and when we can assure voters, as I think we're well on the way of being able to do, that their investments in public education at all levels are being really targeted towards the most effective strategies and leverage points to achieving our state's outcomes. So we think it has to be strategic, it has to be thoughtful, that there are a variety of different ways to do it. There's not one single sort of very best optimal revenue plan out there, and it's mostly about getting the strategy and the timing right.
I would add very quickly to Ben's remark this will help me answer more fully the prior question, that one of the things we're doing in the Oregon University system is trying to reduce the time and cost to degree. So we don't necessarily control the revenue streams, but we can surely do everything humanly possible to reduce the price to students. And we're currently doing that by expanding dual credit options, by looking at ways to partner with high schools in a more robust way to allow them to take credit-bearing courses with their universities and get a jump start when they begin their time with us or at community college. We also are looking at this through a statewide effort on proficiency-based education that would allow our faculty to acknowledge the learning that took place for our students before they came into our classrooms. So while we don't control the revenue streams, we sure can make some progress in terms of how much of the price of admission we're passing to students.
Unfortunately, we've run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join us next week when U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley will discuss how we can reverse the decline of the middle class. And as we close today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to today's panelists. We are adjourned.